Welcome to today's storytime on our channel. Get ready for a thrilling journey through Sarah's Descent, where we follow the life of a woman torn between the safety of her familiar world and the dangerous allure of a bad boy's thrill-seeking lifestyle. This is a tale of temptation, betrayal, and the harsh consequences of living life on the edge. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into this captivating story of one woman's search for excitement that leads her down a path she never expected. Sarah thought the DJ at the reception seemed to have a knack for playing every song she secretly hated. She hadn't wanted to come to the wedding in the first place, but Ethan's old college roommate getting hitched left her with no choice but to grit her teeth and bear it. Glancing around, she wondered where Ethan had gotten to and spotted him across the room, deep in conversation with some stranger by the bar. Great, she thought, feeling a wave of dismay wash over her. This is officially worse than attending someone else's high school reunion. Her mood lifted instantly, however, when a familiar voice called out her name. It was Chelsea, her best friend from high school, drink in hand and looking ready to party. They hugged excitedly, and Chelsea quickly introduced her to her boyfriend, Jax. Sarah took note of his tall stature, jet black hair, a hint of stubble, and the silver earring glinting in the light. His outfit, tight black jeans, a worn leather bomber jacket, and a plain t-shirt, stood out among the more formally dressed men in the room. Yep, definitely a bad boy, Sarah thought, momentarily envious of Chelsea's taste in men. As the two women chatted animatedly, Jax looked around with a hint of contempt. Chelsea, noticeably tipsy from several trips to the bar already, provided a welcome distraction for Sarah. There was a lull in their conversation, and Jax took the opportunity to ask Chelsea, "So, why'd you call her PK anyway?" Chelsea let out a loud laugh. "Oh, because she used to be a total preacher's kid," she replied. It was a label that had followed Sarah since childhood, a consequence of her father's position as a Methodist minister in the Denver suburbs. Despite the pressure to be a perfect preacher's daughter, Sarah had rebelled at every opportunity, much to her parents' dismay. She was smart but couldn't be bothered with grades or discipline. By 14, she was sneaking out to meet boys with questionable reputations, experimenting with pills and alcohol. She even had a pregnancy scare that scared her enough to start using contraception religiously. Her parents, horrified by her choice in boys, tried to set her up with nicer dates from the church, but Sarah refused to cooperate. Then, during her junior year of high school, her bad boy boyfriend showed up for a date with another girl in the car. After a jealous outburst, Sarah stayed home, only to learn later that both her boyfriend and the other girl had died in a car crash. Her parents, despite disliking the boy intensely, insisted she attend the funeral. The experience shook Sarah to her core. It made her re-evaluate her life and pushed her to finally focus on her studies and cut back on partying. Her parents, relieved and grateful, saw this drastic change as nothing short of divine intervention. Sarah's newfound dedication earned her a spot at the Community College of Denver, where she enrolled in their business administration program. Her father, deeply impressed by his daughter's transformation, encouraged her to attend singles events at his parish. It was at one of these events that Sarah was introduced to Ethan Walker, a newcomer to the church. Ethan was tall and clean-cut, with wavy brown hair and a charming smile. Though undeniably handsome, he was a bit too straight-laced for Sarah's taste. She'd always been drawn to bad boys, after all. However, her opinion of him shifted slightly when she found out he was an FBI agent. Now that was intriguing. Ethan, for his part, was captivated by Sarah's beauty and the values they shared, thanks to their church connection. It wasn't long before they became a couple, much to her parents' delight. By the time graduation rolled around, Ethan and Sarah were engaged. "Living the dream, huh?" Sarah remarked to Chelsea, her voice thick with sarcasm. Chelsea, picking up on Sarah's tone, raised an eyebrow. "So, where is hubby, anyway?" she asked, glancing around. Sarah's response dripped with disdain. "You mean SpongeBob SquarePants?" Chelsea chuckled. "SpongeBob SquarePants?" she repeated, amused. "Yeah," Sarah said, her bitterness evident. "Because he's about as exciting, and he's sucking all the fun out of my life." Chelsea laughed again. "Come on, Sarah, I thought you'd end up with someone way more intense. Like, The Lone Ranger mixed with a little Neo from the Matrix, she joked. Sarah, clearly not amused, retorted, "More like I married a boring accountant." She paused. "Actually, that's not even fair to accountants. I don't even know what he does for a living, he never talks about his job. All he wants to do when he gets home is veg out. There's zero excitement in my life anymore." Sarah was about to launch into a detailed account of her dull existence when she noticed Ethan approaching. He'd obviously been on his phone and looked apologetic about something. Before he could even speak, Sarah introduced him to Chelsea and Jax. Ethan shook hands politely and then told Sarah that they needed to leave early. Something about being on call and having some work issues to deal with. Sarah, already displeased with the reception, was further dismayed by the thought of spending the rest of the evening at home, alone and bored. Sensing her friend's frustration, Chelsea quickly offered to give Sarah a ride home with her and Jax. Ethan, uncertain about Chelsea and uneasy about Jax's obvious bad boy vibes, hesitated but eventually agreed, instructing Sarah not to wait up for him. After Ethan left to speak with the newly married couple, Sarah thanked Chelsea and suggested grabbing another drink. Ever the instigator, Jax proposed ditching the dull reception for someplace more exciting. Chelsea readily agreed, and despite her initial hesitation, Sarah found herself following suit. Outside, Sarah was surprised to see Jax and Chelsea heading for a motorcycle parked near the curb. "Wait, are we all squeezing onto that?" she asked, incredulous. Chelsea confirmed with a nod, and Jax, ignoring Sarah's apprehension, simply said, "Helmets are for sissies." He straddled the motorcycle and watched as Sarah, after a moment of hesitation, adjusted her skirt and climbed on behind him. She could feel his eyes on her, and the thought of impressing this rebellious, dangerous man sent a thrill through her. Once Chelsea was settled behind Sarah, Jax gunned the engine, the motorcycle roaring to life as they sped away from the wedding reception, leaving a trail of exhaust and bewildered guests in their wake. Sarah, a mix of thrilled and terrified, clung to Jax, letting out an involuntary squeal as he took a sharp turn. Jax flashed her a grin, and in that moment, Sarah felt a longing for the excitement her life with Ethan sorely lacked. They eventually pulled up to their destination, a grungy-looking dance club, pulsating with music and bathed in neon lights. The sight of it brought back a rush of memories from Sarah's wilder days, and she practically danced with joy as they entered the club. Chelsea beelined for the bar, eager for another shot, but Jax pulled Sarah aside, shouting over the music. "I've got something way better than booze," he yelled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Intrigued, Sarah leaned in closer. Jax pulled out a small baggie containing 2 pastel-colored tablets. He popped one into his mouth and then offered the other to Sarah. "Trust me," he said with a conspiratorial smile. "You're gonna love Molly." They joined Chelsea at the bar, and after a few more drinks, Jax urged them onto the dance floor. The three of them squeezed into the packed crowd, moving together to the pulsating rhythm. As they danced, Sarah leaned in close to Jax. "So, how's Chelsea handling Molly?" she shouted, her words nearly drowned out by the music. Jax shook his head. "Nah, booze is her thing. Always has been." Sure enough, Chelsea soon reappeared, clutching another shot glass. Sarah, lost in the music and the warm, euphoric feeling that was washing over her, barely noticed. The lights, the beat, the closeness of Jax and Chelsea, it all blended together into a singular, exhilarating sensation. Eventually, Chelsea found an empty chair and promptly passed out. Jax, now free to focus all his attention on Sarah, wasted no time in doing so. They continued dancing, their bodies moving closer, their energy intertwined. Sarah felt completely euphoric, wishing the night would never end. Later, as the club began to empty, Jax scooped up Chelsea and carried her out to the motorcycle. He propped her on the seat and gestured for Sarah to get on behind him. They roared off into the night, the wind whipping through Sarah's hair, the vibrations of the engine coursing through her. They arrived at a nondescript apartment building, and Jax, after effortlessly carrying Chelsea inside, laid her gently on the couch. Sarah followed, still swaying slightly to the music in her head. Jax's eyes met hers, his gaze intense, and Sarah felt a surge of desire. Without a word, he led her to the bedroom. The rest of the night was a blur of passionate kisses, tangled limbs, and a raw, unrestrained intensity that Sarah had never experienced before. As she finally drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of awe mixed with exhaustion. When Sarah woke up, Jax was already dressed. Propping herself up on her elbows, groggy but strangely content, she asked, "How long have we been?" Jax smirked and glanced at his watch. "About 2 hours." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. 2 hours? His grin confirmed Molly's lingering effects. Exhausted but strangely exhilarated, Sarah mumbled, "I don't think I'll ever be the same." She suddenly remembered Ethan. "What time is it?" she asked, panicking. "Almost 2 a.m." Jax replied casually. Sarah's blood ran cold. She leapt out of bed and threw on her clothes while Jax waited patiently. As they left the apartment, Sarah noticed Chelsea still passed out on the couch and felt a pang of guilt. The ride back to her place, though only 15 minutes, felt interminable. Sarah's mind raced, trying to come up with a plausible excuse for her late arrival. When they pulled up to her building, she scrambled off the motorcycle, muttering a hasty thank you to Jax before watching him disappear down the street. As Sarah approached her front door, fear gripped her. She quietly unlocked it, hoping Ethan was asleep so she could slip into bed unnoticed and deal with the consequences in the morning. To her relief, the apartment was dark and silent. Ethan wasn't home. Grateful, she quickly undressed, tossing her clothes into the laundry basket. She skipped her usual shower, afraid of taking too long, pulled on her nightgown, and crawled into bed, sighing in relief. Her relief was short-lived, however. A few minutes later, she heard the unmistakable click of Ethan's key in the lock. Panic surged through her. What if he wants to? She had taken precautions, but the worry lingered. She had to head this off before it went any further. When Ethan entered the bedroom, Sarah flipped on the bedside lamp, her face a mask of anger. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Ethan, startled, simply said, "Work. I had to work." Ignoring his explanation, Sarah accused him of being with another woman. Ethan's denials, his professions of love and fidelity, fell on deaf ears. Exhausted and frustrated from the night's events, Sarah pressed him for details, her anger escalating. Ethan, pushed to his limit by her accusations, sighed wearily. "Look, I had to investigate a crime scene, okay? It was a rough one. Crime happens every day." Sarah shot back, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why was this so urgent?" Ethan's voice grew cold. "It was a double homicide. Execution style. The guys we were tracking, they were taken to a landfill, forced to kneel, and..." He stopped, his voice thick with emotion. "They put bags over their heads, to prevent a mess. When the ME removed the bags..." He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan continued describing the scene in grim detail, his words painting a horrifying picture in Sarah's mind. He finished getting ready for bed, climbed in, and turned his back to her. Sarah, pale and shaken, switched off the light and pulled the covers up to her chin. As she lay there, she noticed the tenderness between her legs, a reminder of the wild night she'd just experienced. But as she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of the execution Ethan had described. "I shouldn't have pushed him so hard," she thought, a wave of guilt washing over her. Sarah slept until noon the next day. Ethan was distant when she woke, but he seemed to warm up slightly as the afternoon progressed. Despite his improving mood, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The excitement of the previous night had awakened something within her, longing for something more, something dangerous. Monday morning rolled around, and Sarah's job at the Denver Public Schools District, where she worked as an administrative assistant, felt even more monotonous than usual. She'd gone to college and earned her degree, and this was what it had gotten her: dealing with a lecherous boss and mind-numbing routine. Sarah felt utterly and completely stuck. Monday morning brought an unexpected surprise. Principal Thompson poked his head into Sarah's office. "Sarah, could you come in here for a minute? I want to introduce you to someone." Sarah entered the principal's office and nearly gasped. It was Jax, but he looked completely different. He was wearing a suit, his hair neatly combed, his demeanor all business. Even his trademark earring was gone. He acknowledged her with a faint grin but otherwise gave no indication that they'd ever met before. After the introductions were made, Principal Thompson and Jax retreated to Thompson's office, closing the door behind them. Sarah, her curiosity piqued, couldn't resist eavesdropping. She discreetly turned on the intercom system, listening intently to their conversation. To her surprise, Jax was pitching cleaning and office supplies. It seemed a far cry from the tough, motorcycle-riding bad boy she'd met on Saturday. As she listened, however, Sarah realized something wasn't quite right. Jax was pushing hard to establish a new business relationship, despite the principal's obvious lack of interest. Undeterred, Jax confidently offered a 10% commission, emphasizing that this generous rate applied to any order size. Principal Thompson, tempted but cautious, asked, "How would the commission be paid?" "Cashier's check. Keeps things simple, bypasses all the red tape." Jax replied smoothly. Principal Thompson agreed to place an order, and Jax promised to deliver the commission check the following morning. Then came the catch. "Just a heads up," Jax added casually. "Due to some issues with cancellations lately, the company now requires simultaneous payment for the order itself. Also by cashier's check, of course." Sarah heard the distinct sound of the principal's chair snapping upright. "That's unusual," he grumbled. "I'm not sure I can issue a cashier's check for that amount." "Well, you did say you wanted to take advantage of this unique offer, right?" Jax countered smoothly. "Tell you what, to make things easier, maybe you could just reduce the order size a bit?" There was a pause, then Principal Thompson sighed. All right, but I need you here before noon tomorrow. I have a luncheon to attend." Sarah knew that luncheon was just an excuse. Principal Thompson was clearly eager to deposit that commission check as soon as possible. She quickly shut off the intercom as the two men left the office. As Jax walked past her desk, he didn't even acknowledge her presence. Sarah pretended to be absorbed in her work, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed a bribe, plain and simple. What was Jax's angle here? And why the cashier's checks? Disgusted by Principal Thompson's willingness to engage in such a shady deal, Sarah briefly considered reporting what she'd overheard. But what good would it do? She pushed the thought aside. That night, trying as she might to forget about it, Sarah found herself thinking about Jax. She dreamed about his intense gaze, his touch, the way he'd made her feel that night at the club. The next morning, Jax arrived at the school, right on schedule. Principal Thompson, practically bouncing on the balls of his feet, greeted him with an enthusiastic handshake and ushered him into his office. "Not now, Sarah. Hold all my calls," he barked, as Sarah passed by with a stack of papers. The moment the door closed behind them, Sarah was back on the intercom. Jax's voice, smooth and confident, filtered through the speaker. "Morning, Principal Thompson. I've got that commission check for you, as promised." It seemed Principal Thompson, anxious to get his hands on the money, didn't even bother asking to see the order confirmation first. Sarah could practically hear him fumbling with the school district's checkbook. Excellent, Principal Thompson said, his voice a little breathless. "I trust this arrangement will be mutually beneficial. Perhaps we can discuss expanding to other products in the future?" "Absolutely," Jax said smoothly. "The possibilities are endless." Principal Thompson, muttering something about his luncheon, hurried out of his office, giving Sarah the perfect opportunity to make a quick escape. She grabbed her purse and practically ran to her car. Instead of driving home, she headed straight for Jax's apartment, the one he'd taken her to on Saturday. She waited in her car, watching the building, until she saw his familiar figure emerge. Sarah jumped out and ran to intercept him. Jax looked surprised to see her, his initial shock quickly replaced with a wary expression. He led her into his apartment, but his eyes never left hers. Once inside, Sarah didn't waste any time. "I know what you're doing," she said, her voice low. "That bribe, the cashier's checks, you're running a scam." Jax didn't bother denying it. In fact, he seemed almost amused by her accusation. "Smart girl. You were listening in, weren't you?" he said with a smirk. That commission check? Fake. The school district's check, however, is very real. And it's already been cashed. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What happens when he tries to cash his check and realizes it's no good? She asked, her voice tight with apprehension. Jax's smirk widened. The beauty of this whole setup? He's trapped. If he reports me, he has to admit he accepted a bribe. He won't do that, not until he's forced to explain where all those cleaning supplies went. By that time, I'll be long gone. So, how much do you want to stay quiet? Jax's gaze was intense, predatory. He clearly expected her to name her price. But Sarah surprised him. I don't want your money, she said, her voice firm. Jax stared at her, genuinely taken aback. No? So, what is it you want then? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Sarah met his gaze, her expression unwavering. Take me with you. Jax hesitated, surprised by her request. He studied her for a moment, considering. Slowly, his expression softened, and a slow smile spread across his face. Are you sure about this, Sarah? Think about what you'd be giving up. Your loving husband, your comfortable life, your nice, safe job. He said, his voice laced with mock incredulity. Are you really ready to chuck it all away and run off with me? A fierce determination blazed in Sarah's eyes. It's funny, she said, her voice husky with emotion. It feels like I've been waiting my whole life for someone like you. And with that, she threw herself at him, kissing him deeply. His hands moved down her body, and Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, he pulled away, his grip on her tightening as he forced her to meet his gaze. I'm leaving town now, he said, his voice low and urgent. Be outside your place in an hour. If you're not there. He let the threat hang in the air. We're taking the motorcycle? Sarah asked, her voice breathless. No, a car. Sometimes you have to leave your toys behind. What about Chelsea? Like I said, toys, Sarah. His expression softened slightly. 1:30. Don't be late. Sarah kissed him one last time and rushed out of his apartment, her head spinning. She drove straight to the bank, withdrew a substantial amount of cash, and then raced home. She threw some essentials into a suitcase, scribbled a hasty note for Ethan, just the word, sorry, along with her wedding ring, and placed it on the kitchen counter. Sitting on her porch, waiting for Jax to arrive, she was hit with a wave of doubt. This is insane, she thought. This is the craziest thing I've ever done. But even as she thought it, she knew there was no turning back. When a nondescript sedan pulled up to the curb, Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran to the car, leaving the front door of her apartment unlocked, and tossed her bag into the back seat. As Jax pulled away, a wave of guilt washed over her. She knew she was hurting Ethan, and she worried about disappointing her parents, but another, stronger feeling rose up to meet it. A fierce determination to take control of her own life. It's my life, she thought, her jaw setting with resolve, and I'm done playing it safe. The next few months were a blur of cheap motels, smoky nightclubs, and spontaneous road trips. Sarah, fueled by adrenaline and a constant stream of pills, barely had time to think. She lived entirely in the moment, embracing the reckless freedom of a life without responsibility or consequences. Jax drove them south to Albuquerque, where they settled into a routine of smoky nightclubs, pill-induced hazes, and reckless abandon. They lived entirely on impulse, embracing a carefree existence devoid of responsibility or accountability. Sarah, for the most part, reveled in this newfound freedom. She enjoyed sleeping late after partying all night, the thrill of living on the edge, the feeling of escaping her past. Occasionally, thoughts of Ethan, of her parents, of her old life, would intrude on her carefully constructed facade of happiness, but she'd quickly push those thoughts aside. That was then, this is now, she'd repeat to herself, clinging to the intoxicating allure of being Jax's girl. One afternoon, however, Jax woke her with an unexpected request. We're low on cash, Sarah. Time for you to get a job. Sarah, still groggy from a night of partying, mumbled. A job? What kind of job? You're gonna be a legal secretary. Jax replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But I don't know the first thing about legal work," Sarah protested. "You'll learn. But first, we need to do a little shopping." That afternoon, they drove to Coronado Center, a sprawling mall on the north side of town. Jax dropped Sarah off at the entrance to Nordstrom. "Don't worry, I'll be close by," he said, giving her a quick kiss before heading off. Inside, Sarah wandered through the women's department, catching a glimpse of Jax a few aisles over. He winked at her, and Sarah, suppressing a nervous flutter in her stomach, got to work. She found a sleek black Alexander Wang pencil skirt, tried it on, then, accidentally, left it hanging slightly askew on the rack. Next, she found a crisp white blouse, repeating the same process. Finally, in the shoe department, she purchased a pair of $300 black high-heeled pumps with cash, stuffing the receipt into her pocket. She found Jax in the food court, sipping a soda and casually flipping through a magazine. He was holding a shopping bag from Champ Sports. "Get everything?" she asked anxiously. Jax nodded. "Shouldn't we get going then?" she pressed, glancing nervously around. "Relax, Sarah," Jax said dismissively. "We're clear." "How can you be so sure?" Sarah asked, still on edge. "Simple," Jax replied. "Stores aren't looking for a guy to shoplift women's clothes. Someone might have seen you browsing, but no one's paying attention to me here. They'll never put it together." "Then why did I have to buy these expensive shoes?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "3 reasons," Jax explained patiently. 1. Shoes are harder to swipe. Staff keeps a closer eye on those. 2. Those fancy designer ones often have those RFID chips, pain in the ass to disable. 3. He paused for effect. If anyone was suspicious, the moment you buy something, they forget about you. Shoplifters don't buy things, especially not expensive ones. Despite Jax's reassurances, Sarah was relieved to be back in their motel room. Jax turned on the TV, flipping to the Weather Channel. "Looks like tomorrow's good for hunting pigeons. I've got a plan." Sarah's stomach clenched. She wasn't thrilled about being part of Jax's schemes, but she knew better than to question him. She was in too deep now. The next day, Sarah nervously headed toward DuPont Park, dressed in her newly acquired outfit. She tried to channel her inner legal secretary as she scanned the park for Jax. She spotted him across the street, leaning against a lamppost. He caught her eye and gave her a subtle signal, directing her to a man sitting alone on a bench near the fountain. The man, who appeared to be in his late 60s, with thinning gray hair and a slightly rumpled suit, was their target. Sarah took a deep breath and approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think you dropped this?" She held out a large, unmarked manila envelope. The man looked up at Sarah, taking in both her appearance and the envelope she was holding. Jax knew what he was doing, she thought, a flicker of admiration mixed with fear running through her. "No, I don't believe that's mine," the man said with a smile, his eyes twinkling kindly. "Are you sure?" Sarah pressed, noticing the envelope had been tucked under the bench where he was sitting. "Positive," he chuckled. "But thank you, young lady." Sarah sat down on the bench beside him, acutely aware of his gaze lingering on the slit in her skirt. "Works every time," she thought cynically. "What should we do about this envelope?" she asked, handing it to him. "It feels kind of heavy." The man hefted the envelope in his hand, feeling the weight of its contents. He handed it back to Sarah. "Maybe there's an address inside?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes wide and innocent. "That's a good idea," she said, leaning a little closer to him. The man chuckled, clearly enjoying her company. Sarah carefully opened the envelope and gasped dramatically. "Oh my gosh," she breathed. "It's full of money." She handed the envelope back to the man, who stared at the stacks of bills in disbelief. "How much is in there?" Sarah asked, feigning ignorance. The man, his fingers trembling slightly, began counting. 20 packets, $2,500 bills in each. That's $50,000. Sarah's eyes widened theatrically. 50,000? She exclaimed. Can we keep it? There's no name, no return address, nothing. We could split it, 25 grand each. The man hesitated, torn between his conscience and the allure of such a life-changing sum. I don't know, we should probably report it. Someone might be missing this. But if no one claims it? Sarah pressed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Just then, as if on cue, Jack strolled up to the bench, looking every bit the successful lawyer in his dark blue suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. Is there a problem here? He asked, his voice smooth and reassuring. Sarah quickly explained the situation, introducing Jax as her boss, a lawyer with an office across the street. Jax examined the envelope and its contents. This looks like drug money, he said, his voice grave. Someone messed up a payoff. We'll need to report this to the authorities, of course, but… He paused, glancing at the elderly man. Once all the legal stuff is settled, the money will belong to you too. Finders keepers. Sarah threw her arms around the older man, who returned her embrace, his eyes shining with excitement. Jax cleared his throat. There is one small complication, he said, his voice serious. Sometimes, these drug dealers will use unmarked envelopes like this for money laundering. They'll let someone turn it in as found money, then claim it back later once it's clean. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. He looked at Sarah, then at the older man. Here's what I suggest. To prove to the authorities that this was a genuine find, we each add some of our own money to the mix. A sign of good faith, so to speak. The older man hesitated, but Sarah jumped in before he could object. I think that's a great idea, she said, her tone bright and enthusiastic. I can withdraw $25,000 from my savings right now. How about you? She asked, turning to her mark. The man, swept up in the moment, readily agreed. Yes, of course. I can withdraw $25,000 from my retirement account. Won't take but a minute. Okay, here's the plan, Jack said, his voice crisp and efficient. Both of you go to your banks, withdraw the money, and put it in an envelope along with the withdrawal receipt. Come right back here, time is of the essence. Sarah and her new friend hurried off to their respective banks, their excitement palpable. They returned a short while later, each clutching a plain white envelope. Jax took the envelopes, added them to the original stack of money, and then sealed it all in a fresh envelope. Just to prove to those cops that we haven't touched a cent of this, he explained, winking at the elderly man. Jax then glanced at his watch, frowning slightly. There's been a bit of a delay. Seems like there's a major accident on the interstate, holding everything up. Those detectives won't be here for a while. He paused, as if struck by an idea. Tell you what, let's not leave this sitting out here. Way too risky. Why don't you put it in your car trunk for safekeeping? I'll let the detectives know where it is when they get here. The older man readily agreed, leading the way as they walked across the street toward the parking garage where he'd left his car, a beat-up old Chevy. As they approached the vehicle, Sarah accidentally dropped her phone, bending over to retrieve it. Here, let me, the older man said, reaching down to pick it up for her. Sarah couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered on her cleavage as she thanked him. She smiled to herself, handing him her phone as a distraction. While the man was preoccupied, Jax deftly switched the envelope containing the cash for an identical one he pulled from his briefcase. This envelope, however, contained nothing but a stack of neatly cut newspaper. Jax deposited the fake envelope in the man's trunk, slammed it shut, and then stepped back with a satisfied smirk. There you go. Safe and sound. I'll handle everything from here, sir. You two just wait by your car. Those detectives will be here any minute. He glanced at his watch again, feigning impatience. Damn, gotta run. Important meeting. Don't worry, I've got this under control. And with that, he turned and hurried away, disappearing into the crowded street. Sarah, ever the consummate actress, engaged the man in a lively conversation about his plans for spending his newfound fortune. When she saw Jax duck down an alley a few blocks over, she made her move. "Excuse me a minute, I need to use the restroom," she said, giving the man a quick peck on the cheek before heading back toward the building. Instead of stopping, she walked straight through the lobby and out the front entrance, where Jax was waiting in a nearby alley. As Sarah slid into the passenger seat, Jax leaned over and kissed her, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Nicely done, Sarah. Flawless performance." "That poor old guy," Sarah said, her amusement fading slightly as she recalled the bewildered expression on the man's face when he had bent over to pick up her phone. "How long do you think it'll take him to realize that envelope is full of newspaper?" "A long time," Jax chuckled. "We'll be long gone." As Jax pulled out of the alley, Sarah settled back in her seat, letting out a nervous laugh. It had all been so easy. And yet, as the adrenaline faded, Sarah couldn't shake the image of the man's worn clothes, his hopeful expression. "He probably has a lot of money saved up," she told herself, trying to assuage the unexpected twinge of guilt. "He'll never even miss it." But even as she thought it, Sarah knew it was a lie. And she felt a flicker of sadness, a tiny crack in the carefully constructed wall she had built around her heart. She had craved the excitement of being with a dangerous man, someone who lived life on his own terms. But she hadn't expected to become an active participant in his elaborate cons. "My dad would be horrified if he knew," she thought, picturing her father's kind face creasing with disappointment. And Ethan. The thought of Ethan's reaction only made her angry. "Why should I care what they think?" she muttered to herself, her frustration mounting. "It's my life." To chase away the unwelcome feelings of guilt and doubt, Sarah rummaged through Jax's duffel bag, finding a neatly rolled joint and a lighter. By the time Jax returned, she was high, giggling at nothing in particular, and suddenly starving. Jax grinned at her, his eyes gleaming with amusement. Well, look who's feeling good," he said, leaning down to kiss her. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get some food in you. And then," he added, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, "we can have some real fun." A week later, Jax announced it was time to move on. "We're leaving as soon as I get back," he said, grabbing his keys. "Where are we going this time?" Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. "Business meeting," was all he would say, flashing her a cryptic smile before heading out the door. When Jax returned, they quickly packed their meager belongings into their nondescript car and checked out of the motel. Jax, behind the wheel, headed north on I-25. "Back to Denver?" Sarah asked, glancing at him. "Phoenix," Jax replied, his eyes on the road. "Big opportunity there." He explained that Phoenix's troubled education system, plagued by corruption and chronically underfunded, was now attracting large sums of money from well-meaning but naive donors eager for quick fixes. The current initiative involved providing every student with a laptop computer. "That's where we come in," Jax said, his voice laced with excitement. "We're going to offer them a shipping container full of iPads, at a fraction of the retail price." "And where are we getting this shipping container of iPads?" Sarah asked skeptically. "Let's just say they fell off a truck," Jax replied evasively. "Don't worry, I've got some contacts. We're going to finance the whole thing through the Bank of Moscow." Sarah had never heard of the Bank of Moscow. "The Bank of what? What is that, some kind of Russian mafia thing?" Jax shrugged. "Something like that. They front the money for these kinds of deals, taking a cut of the profits. Keep their hands clean. If the con goes south, or if the borrower can't pay up, well, let's just say they have their methods of collecting." Sarah's stomach churned uncomfortably. "What kind of methods? And what happens if this family can't pay them back?" "Let's just say," Jax said, his voice turning cold, "the Bank of Moscow always collects." He didn't elaborate, but the underlying threat was clear. Sarah, despite her apprehension, couldn't deny the thrill that shot through her as she contemplated the sheer audacity of Jax's plan. She tried to push down her lingering doubts, focusing instead on the potential payoff. $2 million. A new life, free from the stifling boredom of her old existence. The day after checking into a rundown motel near Sky Harbor Airport, Jax took Sarah on a whirlwind shopping spree in Scottsdale. They returned to the motel with bags overflowing with designer clothes. Lacy lingerie from Agent Provocateur, a sleek Armani suit from Saks Fifth Avenue, and a pair of buttery soft Burberry ankle boots. Sarah insisted on paying cash for the boots. She might have been living on the edge, but some habits die hard. That evening, Jax went over her role in the scam. He'd already arranged a meeting with Councilman Blake, the head of Phoenix Futures, a prominent education-focused nonprofit. Sarah had a new identity, April Johnson, Vice President of Sales for Global Resources, a company Jax had apparently just invented. "Just focus on the big picture, Sarah," Jax said, his hand on her thigh, his thumb stroking her skin. "Think about what we can do, where we can go with that kind of money. A whole new life, together. That's all the motivation you need." Despite Jax's confident facade, Sarah spent a restless night, tossing and turning as anxieties swirled in her mind. The next morning, she couldn't even stomach a cup of coffee. She felt nauseous, terrified of screwing everything up. She felt a little steadier after showering and changing into her new power suit and those ridiculously expensive boots. "Work those angles, babe," Jax said, giving her a quick kiss before she left for her meeting. "This Blake guy's got a reputation." Sarah took a deep breath and pushed open the door to Blake's office. As she launched into her carefully rehearsed pitch about procuring 10,000 iPads at a significantly reduced price, she couldn't help but notice how intently Councilman Blake was watching her. She experimented, crossing and uncrossing her legs, noticing how his eyes followed her every move. Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She shifted tactics, focusing less on the specifics of the deal and more on stroking Blake's ego. She praised the work of his foundation, highlighting the political capital to be gained from being seen as a man of action, a problem solver. Leaning in conspiratorially, she said, "Just imagine, Councilman, the impact this could have. Think of the boost to your public profile, the possibilities for a mayoral campaign, even. With your leadership, your vision." As she spoke, her jacket gaped open slightly, revealing a tantalizing glimpse of lacy black bra. Blake didn't even try to hide his appreciative gaze. Sarah pressed on, her voice smooth and confident. "And to sweeten the deal even further, my company is prepared to offer your foundation a little incentive. A contribution to your campaign fund, let's call it. Say, 1% of the retail value? $80,000, deposited directly into your account." Blake's eyes widened, but he quickly recovered his composure. "This is all very interesting, Miss Johnson. But I'm going to need some time to consider your proposal. Do you get back to me tomorrow?" "Of course, Councilman," Sarah purred, rising from her chair. "But I should mention, we've had a lot of interest in this particular shipment. Other buyers, equally eager. These iPads tend to move quickly." Blake, clearly hooked, agreed to meet with her again the following day. Sarah practically floated out of his office, a triumphant smile on her face. She could barely wait to tell Jax the good news. He was ecstatic when she recounted the meeting, particularly Blake's enthusiastic reaction to her charms. Jax pulled her close, his kiss both hungry and congratulatory. Sarah's excitement, fueled by adrenaline and the promise of their future success, shifted quickly to pure, unadulterated desire. They tore at each other's clothes, collapsing onto the rumpled motel bed in a frenzy of lust. As Jax entered her, his voice a low growl in her ear, he said, "You missing your old life now, Sarah? Wishing you were back home with, what was his name, SpongeBob?" "Forget about him," she gasped, her words muffled against his skin as she pulled him closer. "Forget about everyone. This is what I want. Right here, right now. Give it to me, Jax." The next day, Sarah returned to Councilman Blake's office, dressed to kill, or at least to close a deal. She'd chosen another, borrowed, outfit for the occasion, a charcoal gray pencil skirt that hit several inches higher than her usual work attire and a silk blouse with a neckline that plunged daringly low. She strode confidently into Blake's office, her apprehension momentarily forgotten as she noted his appreciative once-over. Hooked, she thought to herself, trying to suppress a triumphant smirk. "Miss Johnson, a pleasure to see you again." Blake gestured for her to sit down. "I've reviewed your company's proposal thoroughly," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "And I must say, I find it very intriguing." Sarah smiled to herself, waiting for the inevitable, but it came sooner than she expected. "However," Blake continued, his expression turning serious, "during my investigation, I came across a rather curious case. Seems that about 9 months ago, the Denver public school system placed a rather large order for cleaning supplies from a new vendor." He paused for effect, watching Sarah closely. "These cleaning supplies never arrived, of course. An inquiry was launched. Turns out, the head of purchasing for the district, well, he'd accepted a rather substantial bribe from the supplier. The supplier, it seems, was completely fabricated. Non-existent, in fact." Sarah's blood ran cold. He knows, she thought, her mind racing. He knows about the scam. The cops are probably right outside, waiting to arrest me. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and she could feel beads of sweat gathering at her hairline. It took all her willpower to stay seated, to keep from bolting out of the office and never looking back. "But," Blake continued, a slow smile spreading across his face, "what I found most interesting about this case was the method of payment. The bribe, you see, was paid via cashier's check. Rather ironic, isn't it? The cashier's check, just like the cleaning supplies, was completely bogus." Sarah felt dizzy. She was going to pass out. Blake continued, oblivious to her inner turmoil. "I'm going to accept your proposal, Miss Johnson. However, I do have a few conditions." Sarah, confused now, tried to quell the panic rising in her chest. Was she getting the deal or not? Blake went on to outline his demands. "First, the campaign contribution, the $80,000. That needs to be in cash. Delivered with the merchandise." Sarah's mind raced, calculating. Where would Jax get that kind of cash? "Second, I'm going to need to see these iPads. All 10,000 of them." Of course he does, Sarah thought. But how would they even manage that? "And finally," Blake said, his voice dropping to a husky whisper, "I'd like you to join me for the evening, at the Arizona Biltmore. Let's just say I'm a big believer in sealing deals, in person." Sarah stared at him, speechless. "I understand if you need to discuss this with your colleagues," Blake said smoothly, misinterpreting her silence. "But I'm on a bit of a deadline here. Don't keep me waiting too long." Sarah stormed out of Blake's office, fuming. She was furious, but what was the point of arguing? She had a sinking feeling this was all going to go sideways, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be around when it did. Back at the motel, Jax took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. "What happened? What did he say?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Sarah launched into an angry summary of Blake's conditions, focusing on the demand for cash. Jax, however, didn't seem fazed. "Didn't see that coming, but it's not a deal-breaker. I'll talk to my contact at the Bank of Moscow, see what they can do." Sarah glared at him. "And what about his demand to see the iPads? Where are we magically going to produce 10,000 iPads from?" "Relax, Sarah, the Russians have that container stashed at the port. I'll arrange a little viewing for your councilman friend when I go see about the cash. Don't worry, we've got this." Sarah's anger was building with each passing moment. "No, Jax, we don't got this. Because I am not sleeping with that creep." Jax looked at her as if she'd suddenly sprouted a second head. "Sleeping with him? What are you talking about? That's his third condition. He wants you to go to bed with him." Sarah gaped at him, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You knew?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You knew that was part of the deal all along?" "Come on, Sarah," he said, his voice softening slightly. "He's interested, that's a good thing. We've got him right where we want him." "I'm not a whore, Jax," she spat back, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't sleep with anyone I don't want to sleep with, and I sure as hell don't want to spend the night with that self-righteous. Jax grabbed her shoulders, his grip tightening until she winced. Get a hold of yourself, Sarah, he hissed, shaking her slightly. It's time you learned to use every tool at your disposal in this game. Yesterday, you were all about batting your eyelashes and showing a little cleavage. You're already using sex to sell, honey. Just use a little more to close the deal. How will you feel about me? If I do this, what will this do to us? Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face now. Jax pulled her close, his embrace surprisingly gentle. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Sweetheart, I'll admire you even more if you pull this off. This deal, it's huge. It's like hitting the jackpot. Trust me, one night with this guy, it means nothing to me. Sarah stared back at him, uncertain. She felt pressured, manipulated. She hadn't signed up for this. She hated the thought of prostituting herself for Jax's gain. But the thought of that money, the thought of escaping her past, of building a new life with Jax, it was too tempting to resist. And, if she was being honest with herself, she wanted to impress him, to prove that she was capable of playing this game, his game. With a sigh of resignation, she nodded reluctantly. Fine, but this better be worth it, Jax. Jax, relieved, shifted gears immediately, his focus returning to the practicalities of the situation. Okay, here's the plan. Now that we've got him on the hook, we can use the cash as leverage. Sarah listened as Jax outlined his strategy, her mind spinning, her stomach churning with a toxic cocktail of fear and excitement. Following Jax's instructions, Sarah called Councilman Blake. Councilman Blake? April Johnson here. Just wanted to confirm our agreement and set up a time to finalize everything. How about we meet at the Arizona Biltmore, day after tomorrow evening? Blake, clearly thrilled that the deal was moving forward, readily agreed. His enthusiasm waned considerably, however, when Sarah added a little caveat. Oh, and one more thing, Councilman. If you expect that campaign contribution to be in cash, well, then the payment for the iPads will also need to be in cash. Fair is fair, right? We both need to be protected. Now hold on a minute, Miss Johnson. Blake sputtered. No, Councilman, I think you'll find this is standard practice in these kinds of transactions. To ensure that neither party is exposed to unnecessary risk, we both need to operate on equal footing. Cash on delivery. No exceptions. Blake was furious. That's absurd. How am I supposed to get $2 million in cash? The largest bill is $100. We're talking about an enormous amount of. Sarah shot a nervous glance at Jax, who gestured for her to hold firm. She took a deep breath and continued, her voice cold and professional. If you can't manage the cash, Councilman, then perhaps you should consider offering us an alternative form of payment. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll have to withdraw our offer. I'm sure we can find other buyers who are more flexible. There was a tense silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Blake spoke, his voice strained. What about Eurobonds? They're as good as cash, and the foundation has plenty of those on hand. Would that work? Sarah glanced at Jax, who shrugged noncommittally and quickly scribbled something on a piece of paper, holding it up for her to see. Stall. Let me consult with our financial people, Councilman, Sarah said smoothly. I'll get back to you within the hour. As soon as she hung up, Jax pulled out his phone, dialing a number Sarah didn't recognize. He spoke rapidly in hushed tones, listening intently before hanging up. Well? Sarah asked, anxiety gnawing at her insides. What did they say? Will they accept those euro things? Euro bonds are like bearer bonds. Whoever holds them can redeem them for cash, no questions asked. Jax explained, pacing back and forth. They're often used for money laundering, so the Bank of Moscow is familiar with them. As long as they're legit, they'll accept them as payment. So, what does that mean? Sarah asked, confused. It means we've got him, babe. He's desperate to close this deal. He's probably already drafting his victory speech. He's not going to let a little thing like $2 million in Eurobonds stand in his way. He grinned, his excitement palpable. After taking a few minutes to calm her nerves, Sarah called Blake back, confirming that her financial advisors had approved the Eurobonds as payment. The deal was set. Despite her initial excitement, Sarah's emotions were starting to feel like a roller coaster. One minute she'd be riding high, swept up in Jax's confidence and the thrill of the con. The next she'd be plunged into a deep pit of anxiety, filled with self-doubt and a growing sense of unease. Jax's constant praise, his reassurances that she was crucial to their success, helped somewhat. But sometimes when he'd look at her with that calculating gleam in his eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was just a pawn in his game. And the thought of Blake, his eyes hot with lust, expecting her to service him, well, it made her skin crawl. What disturbed her even more, though, was Jax's willingness to put her in that position, to use her as bait. 2 days later, Sarah arrived at the Arizona Biltmore, dressed in a dark gray maxi dress that Jax had insisted she buy. The dress, with its low-cut back and flowing fabric that skimmed her curves, was both sophisticated and undeniably seductive. The fact that Sarah wasn't wearing a bra only added to the effect. She arrived early, positioning herself strategically across the lobby. When Blake entered, his eyes immediately found her. Sarah turned slightly, giving him a glimpse of her bare back, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face as he hurried towards her. Dinner was a blur of expensive wine, overcooked steak, and Blake's endless monologues about his foundation's successes, all of which he attributed solely to his own genius. Sarah feigned rapt attention, but her thoughts were drifting. She'd spotted a man across the restaurant who reminded her of her father, and a wave of rebellion washed over her. "I'll do whatever I want," she thought defiantly, pushing down the unwelcome twinge of guilt. Interrupting Blake mid-sentence, she purred, "Why don't we take this conversation upstairs? And maybe finish off that bottle of wine?" Blake, predictably, was eager to comply. In the elevator, Sarah pressed herself against him, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered, "I've been thinking about you all day, Councilman." Once inside his suite, Sarah wasted no time in taking charge. She took a long swig of wine straight from the bottle, then let the dress slide from her shoulders, revealing her black thong and impossibly high heels. She pulled Blake toward the bed, her fingers already unbuttoning his shirt. Pushing him down onto the mattress, she straddled him, guiding his head between her legs. "Go on," she commanded, her voice husky with feigned passion. "Eat me." Several minutes later, she pulled away, silencing his protests with a bruising kiss. "Now take your clothes off," she ordered, her voice cold and distant. When Sarah woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the gaps in the curtains, her head throbbing, her mouth tasting like stale cigarettes and regret. As she blinked open her eyes and peered over the edge of the bed, she saw a pair of legs clad in suit pants and expensive dress shoes standing directly in front of her. Blake, already dressed, was looking down at her, his expression unreadable. The memory of his hands on her, of his mouth on her, sent a wave of revulsion through her. She grabbed the sheet, wiping the remnants of his semen from her face. Blake, noticing her movement, sat down heavily in a nearby armchair. "Let's get down to business, shall we?" he said, his voice brisk and impersonal. Gone was the smooth-talking charmer from the night before. This was Councilman Harrison Blake, in control, all business. "Here's how this is going to work," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You'll be at my office at 5 Pages M, today, with the 80,000. Cash. In a briefcase. Come alone. No tricks. Or the deal's off. Understand?" Sarah nodded silently. Blake went on to outline the plan for the exchange. They would drive together to a self-storage facility he'd rented, each securing a heavy-duty padlock to the unit. They'd lock the money inside, so neither of them could tamper with it. Then they would drive to the port to inspect the iPads. Once Blake had confirmed the merchandise was legitimate, they'd return to the storage unit and retrieve their respective payments. "No funny business, Miss Johnson," he warned, his eyes cold and hard. "I don't appreciate being played. And you, well, let's just say you'd be wise to remember who's holding all the cards here." He added a crude parting remark, a final reminder of his power, before leaving her alone in the silent suite. Back at the motel, Jax was pacing anxiously when she arrived. "Well, how'd it go? What did he say?" he asked, his voice a mix of eagerness and apprehension. Sarah told him everything. Jax listened intently, his expression shifting as she described Blake's demands, his security measures for the exchange. He didn't seem worried about the cash, though. "Don't sweat it, Sarah. I'll handle that. I'll get in touch with the Russians, figure out the logistics." While Jax was on the phone, Sarah packed their belongings, her heart heavy with a mix of depression and self-loathing. Blake's treatment of her, his casual cruelty, his assumption that she was nothing more than a high-priced call girl, filled her with shame. She tried to chase away the dark thoughts by focusing on the money, imagining all the things she could do, the places she could go, once they had their $2 million. A trip to Paris, maybe? A fresh start, a new identity, far away from Jax, far away from this life. She was lost in a daydream of Parisian cafes and cobblestone streets when Jax returned. He set a large, heavy briefcase on the bed, his expression grim. "Got it all figured out," he said. 80,000, right here. Don't let that briefcase out of your sight until it's locked up tight in that storage unit, understand? One screw up, and we'll have those Russian goons breathing down our necks. And you don't want to piss them off. How's it all going to work? How do we? Sarah began, but Jax cut her off. It's better you don't know, babe. Less chance of you accidentally spilling the beans. He gave her a reassuring smile, but his eyes were cold. He spent the next few minutes coaching her on her final act, her role in the grand finale of this elaborate con. Sarah listened attentively, nodding confidently. She had to make this work. At 5 o'clock sharp, Jax dropped Sarah off in front of Councilman Blake's office, the heavy briefcase weighing her down, both physically and metaphorically. Jax pulled up in front of Phoenix Futures, the nonprofit Blake headed. "Here you go, babe. Break a leg," he said, his grin a little too wide, a little too sharp, as he handed her the briefcase. Sarah was surprised by its weight. As she walked toward the building, she felt the burden of responsibility pressing down on her. Inside, Blake was waiting for her, his expression a mix of impatience and barely contained excitement. He reached for the briefcase, but Sarah held on tight. "Just need to count it, Miss Johnson. Standard procedure, you understand," Blake explained, holding up a thin stack of Eurobonds. "And you're welcome to verify these, if you'd like. Wouldn't want you to think I'm trying to pull a fast one on you." Sarah took the bonds, carefully examining each one. She snapped a quick picture with her phone and sent it to a number Jax had given her, a supposed financial expert. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply, "Legit." Relieved, Sarah handed the bonds back to Blake and allowed him to take the briefcase. She watched as he quickly counted the stacks of bills, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "All right, Miss Johnson, let's go see these iPads, shall we?" Blake led her out to his Mercedes and drove them to a secluded self-storage facility on the outskirts of town. "Picked this place for a reason," he explained as he unlocked the gate. "Nice and private, no need for unwanted disturbances." He pulled up to a large roll-up door and unlocked it, revealing a small, sparsely furnished storage unit. There was a single metal shelf running along one wall. Blake placed his briefcase on the shelf and gestured for Sarah to do the same. They each secured their respective briefcases with a heavy-duty padlock, ensuring that neither of them could access the contents without the other's key. Back in the car, Blake headed east, merging onto the Loop 202 freeway. He navigated the maze of highways and industrial parks, eventually turning onto a side street that led to the sprawling port of Phoenix. The port was a vast, chaotic landscape of colorful shipping containers stacked high, towering cranes moving back and forth like giant metal giraffes, and the constant hum of engines and machinery. Sarah consulted a piece of paper Jax had given her, directing Blake through the labyrinth of containers until they reached a bright blue one with a Cyrillic inscription stenciled on the side. Sarah double-checked the container number against her notes and then handed Blake a key. "Here you go, Councilman. Enjoy the show." Blake unlocked the padlock and swung open the container doors, revealing rows upon rows of cardboard boxes, each emblazoned with the familiar Apple logo. He eagerly ripped open the nearest box, pulling out a gleaming new iPad. Excellent. Just as promised. Brand new, still in the shrink wrap. Top of the line models, too. He chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. Might want to check those boxes in the back, Councilman. Just to be sure they're all the same. Sarah suggested sweetly. Blake, eager to confirm his triumph, strode towards the back of the container. As he did, Sarah moved toward the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was now or never. She reached for the locking bar, trying to swing the heavy doors shut, but something was wrong. The locking mechanism was jammed. Damn it! She hissed, yanking on the bar. It wouldn't budge. Blake, hearing her struggle, turned around. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. Sarah didn't answer. She shoved past him, sprinting down the narrow alleyway between the towering containers. Sarah yanked on the container door, but the locking bar wouldn't budge. It was jammed. Damn it, come on, she muttered, throwing her weight against the heavy metal doors. Blake, realizing what was happening, let out a roar of rage. Stop, get back here, he shouted, scrambling over the boxes toward the front of the container. Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted down the narrow alleyway, her heart pounding. She could hear Blake's footsteps closing in behind her, his enraged shouts echoing off the metal walls. She burst out of the maze of containers, her eyes scanning frantically for Jax's car. There it was, idling at the curb. She threw herself into the passenger seat, gasping for breath. Go, 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 she screamed. Jax didn't need to be told twice. He hit the gas, the car lurching forward just as Blake emerged from the alleyway. He sprinted back to his Mercedes, but his path was blocked by a massive 18-wheeler that had just pulled across the entrance, its engine rumbling ominously. Blake, his face contorted with fury, pounded on the truck's hood, screaming at the driver to move. The driver and his partner, however, just stared back at him blankly, speaking a language Blake didn't understand. They continued unloading their cargo, seemingly oblivious to his increasingly frantic demands. Blake, defeated and frustrated, watched helplessly as Jax's car disappeared into the stream of traffic. As they sped away from the port, Sarah, her body still trembling, felt a wave of relief wash over her. I thought he was going to catch us, she gasped, her voice shaking. I felt like I was running through tar. Relax, babe, he's not going anywhere, Jax chuckled, glancing at her. He'll be stuck there at the mercy of those truckers for at least an hour. What if he calls the cops? What if they're waiting for us at the storage place? Sarah asked, her anxiety returning. Don't worry your pretty little head about it, Jax said dismissively. Blake's not going to involve the cops. Not when it means risking his precious political career. He'd have to explain a lot of things he'd rather keep under wraps. Trust me, we're in the clear. When they arrived at the self-storage facility, the place was deserted. Sarah hurried to unlock the padlock on Blake's briefcase, while Jax retrieved a pair of bolt cutters from the trunk. He easily snapped the padlock on their own briefcase, a triumphant grin spreading across his face as he swung open the storage unit door. But his grin vanished instantly. The unit was completely empty. Jax stared at the empty space, his face pale with disbelief. He searched frantically, yanking open empty boxes, tossing aside piles of old blankets. Nothing. He spun around, grabbing Sarah by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin. Where is it? Where's the money, Sarah? Where are the briefcases? He demanded, shaking her roughly. Sarah, her confusion mirroring his, pulled away, her eyes darting around the empty storage unit. I don't know. We left them right here, on the shelf. I saw them before we locked up. Blake. He must have doubled back. That son of a... Jax's voice trailed off, his face ashen. Jax, what are we going to do? The Russians, they're going to kill us if they don't get their money. Sarah cried, grabbing his arm, her voice laced with panic. We can talk to them, explain what happened, maybe pull another job, pay them back somehow. Let go of me, you stupid bitch. Jax screamed, shoving her away with such force that she stumbled backward, falling hard onto the concrete floor, a sharp pain shooting through her hip. "I've got to get out of here." Ignoring her pleas, Jax scrambled towards his car. He yanked open the driver's side door, but before he could get in, two black SUVs screeched into the driveway, blocking his escape. Several men, their faces grim, jumped out of the SUVs and surrounded Jax, their movements swift and practiced. They bound his hands behind his back with zip ties and shoved him into the back of one of the SUVs. Sarah stood there, paralyzed with fear, as two of the men approached her, their faces hard and unforgiving. Rough hands grabbed her, twisting her arms behind her back, securing them with plastic cable ties. She was shoved into the SUV alongside Jax, her ankles quickly bound together. She glanced at Jax, her heart pounding in her chest. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale and drawn. One of the men pulled a burlap sack over his head. Then, another sack was roughly placed over Sarah's head, plunging her into darkness. "Please, you don't have to do this. Let us go," she pleaded, her voice muffled by the rough fabric. "Shut up," a harsh voice commanded. Sarah, terrified, obeyed. The SUV sped off, tires squealing. Trapped in the darkness, her heart racing, Sarah remembered Ethan's story about the mob execution. The bodies dumped at the landfill, their faces. She started to sob uncontrollably, her imagination conjuring up horrifying images. "They're going to kill us. They're going to shoot us in the head. I'm going to die like this, in the dark, with a bag over my head." Tears streamed down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She strained to see through the thick fabric, hoping against hope that someone might see them, might call the police, might somehow save them. But then she remembered the SUV's tinted windows. No one could see them. No one could help them. Despair settled over her like a shroud. "What have I done?" she thought, her mind filled with a chaotic jumble of regret and self-recrimination. She thought about Ethan, about her parents, about the life she had so carelessly thrown away. She thought about the old man she and Jax had conned, his trust, his hopes for a comfortable retirement, all shattered because of her greed. Desperate, Sarah tried to remember the prayers her father had taught her as a child, the comforting words that had always brought her solace. "Please, God, just let me live. I'll change my ways. I promise, I'll do anything, just please." But her mind was blank, her thoughts scattered like leaves in a hurricane. All she could feel was the cold, hard truth of her situation. She was going to die. She slumped against Jax's shoulder, a mix of anger and self-pity churning inside her. She could hear him whimpering softly beside her, his fear a palpable presence in the cramped darkness. The pain throbbing in her hip, a constant reminder of his cowardly shove, fueled her anger. "He was going to leave me behind," she thought bitterly. He didn't even care. The SUV made a sharp turn onto a rough, unpaved road, and Sarah's fear spiked. They were headed out of the city, to some remote, deserted location. A landfill, most likely. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she began to sob uncontrollably, her body shaking with terror. The SUV screeched to a halt, throwing Sarah forward against the seat in front of her. Before she could catch her breath, the door next to her was flung open, and rough hands grabbed her legs, pulling her out of the vehicle. "Hold still," a harsh voice commanded. A hand fumbled with the cable ties around her ankles, freeing her legs. She was yanked to her feet, pulled roughly alongside the SUV. She could hear Jax stumbling beside her, his whimpers growing louder. They were led across uneven, rocky terrain, their bare feet slipping and sliding on loose gravel. After what felt like an eternity, they were forced to their knees. Strong hands pushed down on their shoulders, forcing them to the ground. The rocky earth dug into Sarah's knees, but she barely registered the pain. Her fear was all-consuming, a cold, suffocating blanket. "How much longer?" a voice asked from somewhere off to her left. "5 minutes, tops," another voice replied. Sarah was confused at first. Then, the horrifying truth hit her. 5 minutes. She had less than 5 minutes to live. She felt herself starting to faint, her body shutting down in response to the overwhelming terror. A hand grabbed her roughly by the hair, yanking her back upright. She knelt there, trembling uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She heard footsteps approaching from behind. Suddenly, a bright light pierced through the burlap sack, blinding her. Headlights, she thought, her blood turning to ice. They're going to do it now. She screamed as a hand pressed down hard on the back of her head, forcing her face down toward the dirt. At that moment, the bag was ripped off her head. Blinded by the harsh glare of floodlights, Sarah could only see a pair of legs standing directly in front of her. "Is this what you wanted, Sarah?" a bitter voice asked. Sarah gasped, her heart lurching in her chest. That voice, it can't be. "Is this the life you dreamed of? Living like a common criminal, always looking over your shoulder, running from the law? With a man like him?" The voice, though laced with anger and disappointment, was undeniably familiar. It was Ethan. Ethan. Sarah's shame was so overwhelming she could barely breathe. She couldn't meet his eyes. Her head dropped, her gaze fixed on the dusty ground. Ethan's voice softened, but there was a raw, wounded edge to it. "I would have given you anything, Sarah. Anything to make you happy. I would have taken a bullet for you." Sarah, overcome with a crushing wave of guilt and remorse, could only hang her head, tears streaming down her face. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket, and Sarah flinched involuntarily, bracing herself for a blow. Instead, he pulled out a thin manila envelope and tossed it on the ground in front of her. "Since you seem to want it so badly, here are your divorce papers." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He glared at her for a moment, then shifted his gaze to the men standing just outside the circle of light. "I'm done here. You can take over." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, leaving Sarah kneeling there in the dust, her humiliation complete. "All right, folks, show's over," a woman's voice announced. "Let's get back to work." Sarah and Jax were roughly yanked to their feet, their hands still bound behind their backs. They were shoved back into the SUV, and someone tossed the envelope containing Sarah's divorce papers into her lap. As the SUV sped off, heading back toward the city, Jax was the first to recover his composure. "What the hell was all that about?" he demanded angrily. "Who the hell were those guys?" The woman in the front passenger seat turned around to face them, revealing an attractive, no-nonsense African-American woman with a badge clipped to her belt. "That, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice cool and professional, was a little professional courtesy for a fellow FBI agent who wanted to confront his ex-wife. "We thought we'd add a little dramatic flair, you know, for effect." "FBI? You're FBI?" Jax sputtered. "I should have known. How long have you been following us?" The agent laughed. "You too? You're small potatoes, Carter. We weren't even targeting you. We just used you to catch the big fish. The mafia guys you were working with? Rounded them all up this afternoon. Busted their whole operation wide open." Jax's face hardened with understanding. "So you were the ones who took the money from the storage unit?" he said, his voice tight. "Of course," the agent replied, her smile gone now. "It's evidence, after all." "You freaking bastards." Jax swore, his bravado replaced with a bitter rage. "You're an idiot, Carter," the agent shot back. "You should be thanking us. If we hadn't stepped in when we did, those Russian pals of yours would have taken care of you both. Permanently. As soon as you handed over that money. We've been watching you, and them, for a while now. Heard their little plan for you too loud and clear." Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in horror. Jax, all his swagger gone, sank back in his seat, his face pale. After a long, tense silence, Sarah asked quietly, "Where are we going now?" The agent, for the first time, looked directly at her. "Maricopa County Jail," she said. "What did you expect?" Sarah's head drooped, her gaze fixed on the envelope in her lap. The agent studied her for a moment, her expression shifting from anger to something akin to pity. "I don't get it," she said, shaking her head. "Why would you leave a man like Ethan Walker for this loser?" Sarah, unable to meet the agent's gaze, mumbled, "I guess I've always been drawn to bad boys." "Bad boy?" The agent scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. You mean this pathetic excuse for a man who's so scared he's pissed himself? Sarah glanced over at Jax and noticed, to her horror, that his jeans were indeed soaked. He caught her looking and quickly turned away, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. The driver muttered under his breath. Great. Just great. He wet himself. Now I gotta clean the backseat again. The female agent, unable to contain her amusement, laughed out loud. Turning back to Sarah, she shook her head in disbelief. You wanted a bad boy? Honey, you were married to one of the toughest, bravest FBI agents on the entire West Coast. Ethan Walker has more bravery awards than most agents get in their whole careers. That man has taken down mob bosses, drug cartels, bank robbers, and you were looking for a bad boy? I didn't know. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Yeah, you didn't know. And you nearly destroyed him. The agent replied harshly. A lot of us thought he wouldn't make it after you left. He loved you, Sarah. He loved you so damn much. And you treated him like trash. The agent took a deep breath, composing herself. But after tonight, after seeing you with this pathetic worm, I think Ethan's going to be just fine. When he's back on the market, there'll be plenty of women in the bureau lining up to meet him. And you know what? She added, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. I might just be one of them. The driver chuckled. Damn, Agent Evans, I thought you were interested in me. Shut up, Jones. Agent Evans laughed, nudging his shoulder playfully. You know your wife would kill you if she heard you say that. Before the conversation could continue, the driver announced, We're here. He took a sharp turn into the Maricopa County Jail's intake area. Jax and Sarah were escorted into the building and down a long, brightly lit corridor. As they walked, Agent Evans took Sarah's arm, guiding her to the right, separating her from Jax. They reached an empty holding cell. In you go, Sarah, Agent Evans said, her voice devoid of sympathy. Sarah stepped inside the cell, and Agent Evans slammed the heavy metal door shut, the sound echoing ominously through the hallway. Sarah collapsed onto the narrow cot that was bolted to the cell wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. She closed her eyes, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that had swept over her in the past few hours. The adrenaline rush of the con, the heart-stopping terror of what she thought was her impending execution, the immense relief of realizing she wasn't going to die after all, and then the gut-wrenching humiliation of Ethan's confrontation. It was all too much. She felt a surge of relief at being separated from Jax. As she sat there, alone in the cold, sterile cell, the truth of his betrayal sank in. He would have left her behind, without a second thought, to save his own skin. Even if he hadn't tried to ditch me, she thought bleakly, those Russian guys would have killed us both. What was I thinking? She berated herself. How could I be so stupid? So reckless? Her mind drifted back to what Agent Evans had said about Ethan. She sees him as a hero, Sarah realized, a flicker of warmth spreading through her chest despite the grimness of her situation. She even finds him attractive. The thought, unexpectedly, brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. A loud clang, echoing from somewhere deep within the bowels of the jail, snapped her out of her reverie. The sight of the heavy metal bars on the cell door brought the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She was facing years in prison. Years of her life wasted because of her own foolish choices. Just then, Agent Evans reappeared at the cell door. She unlocked it, her expression surprisingly soft. Come on, Sarah, let's go. She led Sarah down a long, empty corridor, toward a heavy steel door marked, Exit. As the door swung open, the cool night air hit Sarah's face, and she took a deep, shaky breath. They had reached the parking lot where a car was idling, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah stared at the agent, confused. What's going on? Where are we going? Agent Evans, without a word, guided her toward the waiting car. As the passenger door opened, a familiar figure stepped out, his face etched with worry. Dad. Sarah gasped, rushing toward him. She threw her arms around her father, burying her face in his chest, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry for everything. It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay. Her father said, his voice thick with emotion, stroking her hair. Let's go home. He gently guided her toward the car and helped her into the passenger seat. As he pulled away from the curb, Sarah, still reeling from her unexpected release, turned to him, her eyes wide with confusion. What's happening? Where are we going? Why am I free? How did you know to come get me? She asked, her voice a jumble of questions. Her father glanced at her, a sad smile touching his lips. We're going home, sweetheart. He repeated softly. Ethan called me. He pulled some strings, got the charges dropped. He asked me to give you a message. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. He said, tell her, this is a parting gift from SpongeBob. A sob escaped Sarah's lips as fresh tears streamed down her face. She was overwhelmed by a mix of conflicting emotions, relief, gratitude, shame, and a profound sense of loss. She wasn't sure if Ethan's actions were a gesture of mercy, a final act of love for the woman he had once cherished, or a cruel reminder of everything she had thrown away. As her father drove her home, through the quiet, deserted streets, Sarah leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights blur past. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, a lot of soul-searching to do. But for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you for joining us on this emotional rollercoaster of Sarah's descent. As we've seen, the choices we make can lead us down paths we never imagined, sometimes with devastating consequences. Sarah's story is a powerful reminder of how easily we can lose ourselves in the pursuit of excitement and how redemption, though hard to find, is never truly out of reach. If you enjoyed this tale of love, loss, and the search for a second chance, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that captivate and inspire. Until next time, keep your head up and remember, it's never too late to turn things around.